Hi, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Thursdays with Troy. We're going to have a really great time this time. As those of you know, I'm Troy Lambert. I'm the education lead for Plottr. I'm a mystery and thriller author. And today I'm going to talk to you about what to do when you finish Nano. Now, we're at the end of NaNoWriMo. And for those of you who don't know, this is the annual event where people from all over the world get together and they attempt to write a novel in 1 month. Usually, this means 50,000 words. That's your goal. Some people have other goals as well. Okay, once you finish with Nano, or in some cases, once you finish writing a project, the big question is, what now? And so I'm going to talk to you today about how to start the revision process. Now, obviously, there's a couple different things involved. If you plotted your story first, then the process is slightly different than if you're a true pantser and discovery writer and you just wrote into the dark all through Nano. And if you finish Nano by doing that, congratulations. That is an incredible feat. Okay, so there's a couple different ways we're going to talk about how to start the revision process. And we're going to talk about how to go through that process and get your manuscript ready for either publishing or sending to an editor, whatever the case may be in your case. So to do that, we're going to look at one of my Plottr files. This is actually my Nano project from last year. And I actually took this project from where it was, a Nano project, and it is currently published under a pen name. And the name of this particular book has changed since that time. But I originally created this book as a project that I was just showing off at various different Plottr webinars. And then I took it and actually made it into a book and actually wrote it for last year's Nano. And there's a long story behind that. I'm not going to go into all of that. I'm just going to tell you that this particular book, it started out that I had plotted this book. Now, as often happens with books, even though I had plotted things out, as I wrote, things changed. Okay, I changed my mind about how I was going to do things. My characters took a slightly different route than I had planned. So I had originally planned this using the Romancing the Beat template. But for the revision process, I've removed that template. Okay, so the first step in the revision process is to, if you don't do this as you go, which is something I'll talk about in a minute, but if you don't do this as you write, what I'm going to do is I went back through my Scrivener file and I looked at what I had actually written. So the titles of some of the scene cards has changed. I'd added a prologue at that point. So Cthulhu makes a decision to go to Delaware in this prologue, and we actually get to meet his sister and learn some of his background. Okay, so I created a prologue that was not part of my original outline. I also changed things as I went along. Okay, so to prep for this, what I'm going to do is first I went over to my tags and I created some various categories and various tags. So for those of you not familiar, in the tags section, you can create your own categories. Now I've created point of view, mood, tension and action level, and status. Now the status I've added because I don't use this as much as I used to because we can color scenes now, and I'll show you that in a minute. But I used to tag scenes by the status in my editing process, whether it was to do as part of my to-do list, it was in progress, so I was working on it, or I was done with the revision process. Okay, so you can see those status down here. Under uncategorized, I have some themes. I don't use themes as much as I used to, but this is just a way to illustrate how you can organize tags. Now, I've got the POV ones up here because I want to be able to look for plot holes in my story. And I'm going to actually show you how I'm going to do that in a minute. I've got a mood thing here so I can see what is my mood throughout this particular story. Now, you notice that one of those moods is wants to see the manager. That's because this is a love story between Cthulhu and Karen, both the epitome of evil, Internet Karen, both the epitome of evil, one from our world, one from the world of the great old ones. Okay. My tension and action level, the reason I have that is I'm going to show you that in a minute as well. On my timeline, I can filter by how much action is happening in a scene and make sure I don't have too many slow or medium speed scenes altogether, because my books, even this one, which is kind of a Lovecraftian romantic comedy type thing, they all have an element of thriller to them. So I want as much high action all the time as possible when I'm working on those things. Okay. So I put that tension and action level slow, medium, and high so that you can tell as you look at your book that I give the reader enough of a breather in this particular section. Okay. I've also, in this particular case, I've created my major places. Now, I haven't created each individual place that part of the story might happen that's within these places. So, for instance, there's a couple of stores that things happen at within Delaware, a couple of restaurants, a pawn shop, things like that. I haven't created places for those, although I might further on in the revision process in various different books. Now, obviously, this book is done, it's published, it's out there, so I'm not going to create any more. But I've created my major places: Delaware, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the Devil's Den, which is actually one of the most haunted battlefields in the world. It's at Gettysburg. Been there a lot. It's a really cool place. I've created a hotel, a not too nice Marriott, and the lighthouse, which is where things all kick off and begin. But these are just the major places. Okay, it's the same for characters. What I've done is I've created the major characters. So my main characters are Cthulhu and Karen. This is the couple that falls in love. Okay, and they're really what the story centers around. However, there are three supporting characters. Gestalt, who's a broodling of Ehort. You know, he's a white hairless humanoid that comes to Earth, and he's been sent to bring Cthulhu back to where he belongs. We've got Kansas Smith, maybe similar to another action adventure hero with a state and a common name at the end. You never know. And then the manager. Now, the manager, I created this kind of generic manager character. Okay, he's the guy that's at the lighthouse initially, but there's a couple of other managers that they approach at various different points in the story, and I've just kind of used him as a generic manager for those situations. He's like Karen's earthly adversary. She always wants to talk to the manager. Okay, and I've actually added Dusty Rhodes, which she actually should be a supporting character. So I'm going to go over and change that because she's one of the supporting characters as well. Okay, so these are supporting characters and my main characters. I haven't created a character for every single little character that is in the book, although I could have. Okay, and if that helps you to do that, but you're going to see kind of my method and my motivation here in a little bit. Okay, I put in a just a generic note here to show you that you can put in notes as well. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the timeline. So the first thing I'm going to do is, if I've already plotted this out, which in this case I'd already plotted it out, I go back and change the scene cards to what I actually wrote. If you didn't plot ahead of time, all you're going to use whatever software that you use to create this story, and you're going to go back in and pull out each of the scenes that you actually wrote. So my original title was Cthulhu Goes to Delaware. The stars align and Cthulhu goes to Delaware Bay. But now I've introduced this part as well, because this is exactly what happened in that particular scene. At least it's a summary of what happened. Now, you can make this summary as detailed as you want with bullet points and all that kind of thing. But the main thing I wanted to show is where it happens. I wanted to see whose point of view it's in, what mood this is, and what the action level is, whether it's high or not. Okay, and I did this for every single one of these scenes. Okay, I've opened with a kind of a medium action scene with Kansas showing off some of his abilities. Our antagonist, Kansas Smith, knows his archenemy Cthulhu is arriving on Earth soon, and he wants him and the secrets of his hidden treasure. Now, what I actually wrote also was that he is warned that Cthulhu is coming by a member of the Great Old Ones. And it's kind of a weird way that he's notified of those particular type of things, right? But that's what I actually wrote, because as I went along, I'm like, how does he learn of these things? So I want to know about these particular things. Okay. And so I've done this for every single one of these. Now, I'm not going to go through every single one of these cards and show you each one, but the meeting of evil minds, Karen and Cthulhu get to know each other. It's kind of a medium action because there's some action in this scene, but there's also just some elements of that romantic comedy type thing here where these two need to get to know each other and determine, are we compatible or are we not compatible? Okay. So what I want to show you at this point is I go up at this point to the filter. Okay. In the filter, there's tons of things I can filter by. Now, I can filter by point of view, but what I've done is pretty much all of these are in Cthulhu's point of view, and all of the other ones are in Kansas' point of view. So I don't actually need to filter for that because I've created 2 timelines for each, right? But if I had several point of views, I could do that. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to look at the high action. I'm going to say, okay, now either some of these I didn't mark correctly as high action, or some of them are medium or slow action, and they probably shouldn't be. So I want to look towards the middle and the end and go, okay, these two are medium, probably action scenes. This one's more of a high action scene. This is more of a medium. So my reader does get a little bit of a breather, but as we get towards the climax of the story, most of these, actually, obviously I forgot to mark those. Those are high action, okay, or they're medium action. This one's medium action. But towards the end, these are high action scenes, okay? So if I put those in there, then I understand that towards the climax, all of my scenes are high action scenes that are towards the end there, okay? So I've marked those things. Then I can filter by the medium, and I can also filter by the slow ones. And I can see that in this particular case, I've edited this to the point where there really aren't any slow scenes. Like they're all medium or high. This is a pretty high action book. It's pretty short. It's pretty fast. So I wanted to keep it that way, right? It's just a little over 50,000 words. So I wanted to keep it high action. I wanted to keep it moving fast. And so I've eliminated pretty much anything that was slow in there after the revision process. Okay. So once I've gone through and I put in all my different tags on my scenes, and I can filter by those tags and see where I need work. Okay. The other thing that I can do is I can come over here to the outline tab, and I can look at this by plot line. So I can filter by plot line, and I can make sure that this story all hangs together and I haven't left any plot holes. Did I leave something in one of these scenes that maybe, should have been fleshed out a little more, something like that? In this case, I can see that I've missed some of my tags, that type of thing. And so I can put those in there. I can insert some of the places and say, okay, this is something that happens in Delaware. I can add the different characters in if I've forgotten to do that. Okay. And I can look through all these things and make sure that the Cthulhu and Karen timeline all hangs together and it all works. Okay. Then once I've done that, I can again filter by plotline and filter by my B story instead. And I can see the exact same thing. Do these things all hang together? Do I have plot holes? And we've done a whole video on plot holes, so I'm not going to talk about that super in depth. But this is just somewhere where you can make sure that your 2 different stories hang together. So you're basically going to get your story structured together, and you're going to start looking at your pacing of your story. Okay? So very first thing, you're going to map your story. Map your story out with just what you've written. You'll notice that there's no template here. Now, when I plotted this originally, I did start with a template, but I haven't added that back in yet at this point, right? Because I don't want to see it. I just want to see if everything kind of works, if the pacing and all that kind of stuff works, okay? So I'm tagging my scenes by action level and all that kind of stuff. I'm looking to see that they work, okay? Now I'm going to use templates. And what I can do is I can say, well, this originally started as kind of a romantic comedy type thing. It has morphed to the point where there's 19 beats and an epilogue and a prologue as well. So there's around 21 beats. And I'm wondering which template is actually going to work for this, which story structure template. Now, understand that no story is going to fit a template perfectly. Usually, that's usually not the case. Almost every time that you'll see someone using a template, they'll say, I started with this template and they did something to it. They added something to it. They did something with the template. Okay. So at this point, you're going to choose use template. And I'm going to go down to these different starter templates, and I might just look at a couple of them. Like I might look at Romancing the Beat and say, oh, that's about 20. And I wonder if that'll still work for my story. So I'm going to enter the Romancing the Beat there, but I'm also going to add a couple of others just to see if they're going to work. Okay. So maybe I'm going to add an action adventure and go, oh, that's 18. That's about right, because, you know, we can look at that part. Maybe that fits Kansas's timeline, something like that. So then maybe I'll move this up here. Okay. So I'll move my Romancing the Beat up here next to the one that involves Karen and Cthulhu. And I'm just going to look through this and I'm going to say, okay, this actually is a setup. The Land of the Great Old Ones is a setup. It introduces our main character in a way that that's compelling. We're going to see some of his flaws, and we're going to introduce Karen right here in H2. So it looks like at a quick glance that this may actually work. So we're just going to have to look at the different elements of this and make sure, because actually the meet cute happens over here, but that's actually okay. That's all right, because we can still work with that, right? And they actually start to get closer as they move into the second scene or the second chapter. Okay, so we can look at that, right? We can look at what's going on with those particular type of things. Okay, now we can come down here and start looking at Kansas Smith, and we can say, okay, well, we need to just move this down a little bit. And it looks like this kind of works too. Now we could look at the hero's journey. We could look at some other templates and see what they look like as well. And again, we're going to have to go through Kansas's story and see how well it actually lines up with the story structure, because more than likely it kind of ends up around here. The conclusion right here is where the doors are closed and the story really ends, and then we have an epilogue after that. Okay, the battle at the Devil's Den, that may be what Wholehearted looks like for our characters. This actually, we're going to want to move that over there, and then this is kind of the same thing. We're going to want to move that over there, but we're like, okay, this may actually work, okay, as our story. So we're going to go, oh, maybe this is actually what Wholehearted looks like, and we're just going to start moving these things around. We're going to start reading through the template, different instructions, and seeing how they work, right? And seeing if that works with our story. If something doesn't work with your story, let's say I go, okay, well, this action adventure doesn't really work with Kansas's story, then at this point, because I haven't really written anything in those scene cards, I can just delete it and try something else. I can say, well, maybe this is more of a hero's journey. So let me look at that and see what that looks like and say, okay, well, it's kind of a hero's journey, but you know, that doesn't have all the beats. Maybe I need to look at doing this a different way, doing the hero's journey a different way and spreading it out. Maybe that will work. Okay, take your time with this part to just see what your story structure actually is. Do you have a 2-act structure? Do you have a 3-act structure? Do you have a 3-act structure? Do you have a 4-act structure? What does this look like? Is your climax in about the right place? Does your inciting incident happen at about the right place? Are there some things in here that you could delete that just don't fit with your story anymore? That type of thing. Okay. But for me right now, I'm going to delete the hero's journey. I'm going to bring back on the action adventure, and I'm going to look at all that later. I won't do all of this live. I can look at that later, because actually I did look at this when I went through the process of getting this ready for my editor and then getting this story ready to publish. Okay, so I went through these things in the developmental stage. And if you need help with something like this, get a critique partner, get somebody else that also uses Plottr, and have them look too and say, okay, does this template fit with this story? Is the climax in the right place? How does this work? And just sit down and talk it out. Okay. And then tag scenes for rewrites or deletion. So in some cases, I would go, oh man, I don't know if I actually need this scene. Well, what I would do, you could tag it, but I can also just tag it with a color like yellow that says, hey, you need to come back and look at that. Or I could tag it with one that says status to do. Okay, maybe I've determined this is slow. It's in Kansas's point of view, and I don't want it to be slow. I don't want to start my chapter 1 with a slow introductory scene. This isn't an epic fantasy. I don't have a lot of time to do a lot of world building. Instead, I'm going to speed this up, right? And so I'm just going to mark that. And maybe you come down to this one and you say, hey, this one too, it kind of just reads wrong. Maybe it needs to be revised. And go through and highlight those things that need to be revised. You can either tag them or whatever you want to do, okay? The next thing that I want to talk about is to use the right software for you when you're going through this revision process. So I always have Plottr open on one screen, and I'm going through the revision process with Plottr. And as I get done with something, as I say, okay, I revised the prologue, I like the prologue, it's the way I want it, it's ready to send to beta readers or my editor, I very simply color it green. And when everything is green all the way across the board, I know, okay, now this is ready to send off to my editor or whatever. But the way I do editing is I write in Scrivener and I edit in Word. And my reasoning for doing that is because it's a mind trick for me. Okay. When I'm writing in Word, when I open Word, my brain knows we're doing technical writing. We're writing a blog post or we're editing something. When I open Scrivener, the only thing I write in Scrivener, generally speaking, is fiction, right? It's all creative writing, or it's some kind of, even if it's creative nonfiction, it's more, it's something that I'm writing that I need my muse to show up for, and I need my imagination. I need that to work. Okay. If I'm writing something technical or if I'm editing, I do it in Word. It's just a way to keep my muse separated between the two different things that they do. But use whichever software works best for you when you're through this revision process, and have a way of tagging these things for yourself and letting yourself know that they're done. Okay. And I do that by go through here. And then a lot of times I'll highlight chapter titles when I'm going through the actual book itself in Word. Okay. So I'll just go through here and I'll either change the color or I will apply a tag that says done. And then when I do that, when I come up here and filter, you can filter by either the color or you can filter by the status. So you can say, I just want to see things that are done, and everything else is going to fade in the background. The only thing I can see is what I said was done. Okay. Or I can do the same thing by color. I can filter by green and say, okay, these are done. Or instead, I can filter by the yellow and say, these are all the things that need revision. And so I can go through my document, whether that's in Scrivener or Word or Google Docs or whatever you use, and I can find these scenes and go, okay, these are the scenes that I need to work on, that I need to work and re-highlight. Okay. And then that's all for that process. Then is when you prepare your work for your editor. Now, if your editor is someone who also uses Plottr, this can be really useful for you. But even if they don't, this can still be useful for you, okay? Because sometimes your editor wants to know what you were thinking when you put together a scene or something like that. So if your editor uses Plottr, you can actually send them your Plottr file, and they can look through and they can say, okay, the chase is on scene, and you've got some text in here, and they know, okay, this is what the writer was thinking when they wrote that particular thing. Or this help police, this is what the writer intended to write about in this scene. Is this scene actually about that? But even if your editor doesn't use Plottr, you can still export your Plottr to Word or whatever other kind of file that your editor uses, right? And you can export it to Word and give them your scene breakdowns, and even give them the template that you intended to use. And then your editor can go through and see, did you actually hit the mark? Does this actually make sense? Is this pacing right? Does this actually hang together? So when you're preparing your work to send to your editor, you can also use Plottr, because you can send your scene breakdowns with your manuscript, and it gives your editor some additional information to work off of. And it prevents those back and forth emails that says, hey, what were you thinking in this page? What were you thinking about this? Some of those back and forth comments. Instead, they've already got the ability to read what you were thinking, what you were plotting out when you were writing your book. Okay. So this is my process for revising with Plottr. It's a part of my process. It's a super quick overview. Is essentially you're going to pull your book apart. Okay, you're going to pull out all the parts that you've written, or you're going to change the scene cards to match what you've written. Okay, so you're going to use it that way. Then you're going to use your tags and your colors to tell yourself the things that you need to know about that particular scene when you're going through the revision process. And at the end of it all, you're going to use Plottr one more time to prep your work to send your editor. You're going to send them your manuscript and your scenes, whether that's in Plottr or in a separate type of document. Anyway, thank you all for joining us for this Thursdays with Troy. I really hope you enjoyed it. I hope that you learned something about the revision process. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. I'm happy to answer them for you. And with that, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next Thursday on another Thursdays with Troy.